Before I read out my paper, I just want to make one comment that the paper is work in progress, and I'm looking forward to some valuable comments and some valuable suggestions so I can move forward with that. Having said that, I'll start with my paper. My paper title is Problematizing Sabda Pramana in Indian Epistemology. Shabda means verbal and pramana means sources of knowledge. So the abstract of my paper goes hence. This paper reflects on various Indian philosophical traditions and focuses on the prevalence and practical importance of testimonial knowledge. Whether and under what conditions testimony, that is Shabda, is a valid and independent source of knowledge, has always been critical to the history of Indian philosophy, especially in Pramana Shastra. Whether it is reducible to more basic source of knowledge, such as inference, this paper examines the nature of testimony and the acquisition of testimonial knowledge. The paper examines the problem of testimony in Indian philosophy by explicitly relating them to the epistemic goals. It argues that the classical debate over Shabda are not merely technical dispute about Pramana theory, but are fundamentally about how we can still aim for knowledge and justified belief when our cognitive inputs are largely linguistic and interdependent. In contrast to other Pramana, it is regarded as socially interdependent, as it cannot be acquired, maintained, and validated in isolation. Rather than relying on individualistic evidence, testimonial knowledge is treated as social act, a joint agency. Before I begin, there is a short disclaimer that in this paper, my purview is not to focus on the philosophy of language, religion, spirituality, or revelation, or their ramification. My primary focus is on the theories of knowledge in Indian philosophical tradition. The aim is to understand whether Sabda Pramana is an epistemologically sound thesis. I attempt to analyze, understand, and critically reflect on the epistemologically grounded theoretical framework of Sabda Pramana vis-a-vis other means of knowledge. Key problem regarding testimonial knowledge in Indian epistemology includes the reliability of speaker, the means of knowledge as dependent or independent, and the validation justification of scriptural authority. I'll not venture out into the question here because I somehow address them later on in my paper. The important aspect for Indian philosophical tradition is called as pramana. Pramana, as translated, is considered as sources of knowledge. Indian epistemology deals with the epistemic instruments, that is, the sources of knowledge. Pramana are the means through which an individual obtains valid and accurate knowledge, that is, prama, of the world. While most school agrees on epistemic instruments, they argue and disagree on the number of epistemic instruments that are factive and produce true belief. Indian theories of knowledge have accredited pramana as fundamental for the production of true belief. While different philosophical schools accept different type of pramana, there is a consensus among them that knowledge must be validated rather than asserted. They acknowledge that reality is complex, therefore multiple epistemic instruments are necessary for all inquiries. Indian philosophy school of thought emphasizes a clear distinction between valid, that is prama, and invalid, that is aprama or mithya jnana, knowledge. The erroneous cognition are analyzed in detail, whether arising from defective perception, fallacious inference, or deceptive testimony, highlighting a critical approach to knowledge production rather than faithful submission to traditions and authority. Various pramanas accepted by different schools include perception, that is pratyaksh, where knowledge is gained by means of senses. The second is inference, also translated as anumana. Knowledge is gained by the means of reasoning. The third is comparison, known as upamana. Knowledge is gained by means of analogy. The fourth is verbal testimony or shabda pramana, where knowledge is gained by means of text such as Veda or via trustworthy person. Postulation or arthapatti, knowledge is gained by circumstantial implication, and non-cognition, anuplabdhi, where knowledge is gained by recognition of negative facts. Well, I'll not be getting into the detail of all the pramanas. I'll be focusing on Shabda Pramana itself. Shabda Pramana means the means of knowledge that is derived from source of a sentence or sentences, which in In Sanskrit, it's called as Vakya, whether profane or sacred. Testimony is an important source of knowledge in Indian philosophical traditions. Scholars have argued that the bulk of a person's knowledge of the world is acquired from the oral or written testimony of others. Until the recent social turn in epistemology, Western classical epistemologies had predominantly recognized perception, inference, introspection, and memory as sources of cognition. However, they do not recognize verbal testimony as a decisive source of our cognition. In contrast, testimony as an independent source of knowledge has been recognized by all Indian philosophical schools except Charvaka, Buddhism, and Vaishashika. Charvaka accept perception as the only valid source of knowledge and rejects testimony, considering scriptural testimony and Vedic knowledge to be nothing more than tools used by the priestly caste to maintain the status quo and earn their living from the ignorant masses. In contrast, the Vaisashika and Buddhists recognizes testimony as a dependent source of knowledge and reduces testimonial knowledge to inference. Those who accept testimonial knowledge as a valid testimony as a valid knowledge source believe that the process of generating testimonial information begins with a speaker S who knows a proposition P by perception, inference, or testimony, where a chain of testimonies are accepted, and wishes to communicate P to someone. That someone is an hearer H. A hearer H gains knowledge through a speech act of S communicating P to H, who must be competent in the language in which P is expressed in order to know the words and the grammatical forms, which H has learned on most accounts primarily through testimony, but also through analogy. In the foundational text, the Nyaya Sutra, Gautama, the founder of Nyaya school, classifies Shabda in two ways. According to Gautama, Shabda can be classified based on the nature of objects, which again are of two kinds. One that relates to perceptible object and the other that relates to imperceptible objects. Another classification offered by Nyaya is based on the sources of knowledge. They again are of two kinds: the scriptural, that is Vedika, and secular, that is Laukika. Vedika refers to knowledge from the Vedas composed by the divine or considered authorless, therefore it is valid. Laukika refer to knowledge acquired from the testimony of trustworthy person, therefore it is valid, whereas knowledge acquired from untrustworthy person is invalid. All the darshanas offer different approaches to the explanation and implication of Sabda Pramana. Like the Samkhya and Prabhakara school of Mimamsa, they reject Laukika as an important source of valid knowledge as it depends on perception and inference. Samkhya and Mimamsa upholds the validity of Vedika as they consider the Vedas to be the revelation of supra-sensible realities beyond the scope of perception and inference. Further, they consider the Vedas to be impersonal. It's called as Apurushaya, as they are not composed by a human person, not even by God. Rather, the Vedas embody the intuitions of the Enlightenment sages. Testimony in Indian tradition is defined as assertion from a trustworthy person, where a trustworthy person has a direct or indirect knowledge and has an intent to faithfully, sincerely communicate their knowledge to others. While assertions are statements that produce knowledge of their content in the recipient or epistemic agent, testimonial knowledge arrives under certain distinct conditions. There are four of them. One of them is, of course, which we have discussed earlier, that the condition, one of them that the speakers should be trustworthy. The second is that the speaker's utterance are syntactically expectancy, semantic fitness, and proximity. Further, the hearer should possess linguistic ability, such as being a competent user of the testimonial language, which means that the hearer must be able to recognize syntactic and semantic structure, and in turn move from individual words to the meaning of a unified sentences. Once all the conditions of the speaker, hearer, and utterance are appropriate, the possibility of testimonial knowledge may arise. I'll get into the how different school of thought view testimony in a different way. It would be a short introduction, a short reference of them. In Indian philosophical traditions such as Nyaya, Mimamsika, Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga, and Jainism, testimony is accepted as an independent source of knowledge, and an anti-reductionist approach is followed. The main epistemic argument is that much of our knowledge, such as existence and the character of distant places, historical events, technical disciplines, arises only through language and cannot be obtained by direct perception or solitary inference. Nyaya scholars have argued that to ascertain a speaker's aim, however, we must be able to comprehend a spoken sentence. We do this by inferring the speaker's intent from what it stated, often with the help of a contextual indicators. As a result, knowing the intention is not always a necessary prerequisite for testimonial knowledge. Mimamsa sharpens this by tying Sabda to the goal of knowing Dharma. Since Dharma is not directly observable and its effects are not always evident in this world, Mimamsikas insist that only Vedic testimony can authoritatively specify which action are proscribed or prescribed. Here, the epistemic goal is not general information, but practically secure guidance for ritual life grounded in a supposed authorless, that is, Apurusha text, whose structure encodes dharma itself. There are two interesting schools of thoughts that reduces testimonial knowledge to inference. They are Buddhist and Vaisheshik epistemologists. For them, testimonial knowledge is dependent on inferential knowledge. As for them, the epistemic agent requires additional epistemic instruments, either perception or inference, that is non-testimonial. Before reliably acquiring knowledge from a speaker's testimony, the approach is more of a reductionist. According to the Buddhist epistemologies, the hearer carries the epistemic burden to infer the credibility and intentions of the speaker's statement. Later Buddhist scholar Dharmakirti stated that trustworthiness is mental property that is difficult to ascertain. Therefore, inference from a speaker's assertions cannot be considered reliable. I'll just highlight few problems that I have observed in testimonial knowledge. My approach was just to highlight what are the problems that we encounter when we are looking at the epistemological basis of Sabda Pramana. The important concern of Sabda Pramana is epistemic autonomy. The question is not whether testimony produces knowledge, but whether it can be considered a distinct source over and above perception and inference, in tune with classical exploration of Buddhist and Vaisesika philosophy. The limitation of testimony is that it cannot provide direct knowledge of the world, unlike perception and inference, which provide first-hand experience. Testimony requires a leap of faith. Now, how does one account for this leap of faith? Is it through authority, religion, gentlemanly culture, or a communitarian pursuit of seeking truth? Another limitation is that testimony relies heavily on the speaker's trustworthiness, which is difficult to verify as the question remains unanswered. Which epistemic norms govern trust? To be courteous to tradition or to reflect via reason or experience critically? Then there is the question of reliability, which many traditions have raised. How can we be sure the testimony we receive is reliable? Now, I'll not get into other aspect of it. Then there are two major regressive problems which I want to highlight. That are, to know that a speaker is trustworthy or an expert, one must either already know the truth of what they say, in which case testimony is redundant, or know it on the basis of others' testimony, which generates an infinite regress. The other problems that I have observed in testimonial knowledge is like, if secular statements are not pramanas in their own capacity, then how can scriptural statement be so? Both are words, and if one is accepted as pramanas, then other two must be accepted as pramanas as well, or at least in similar criteria must be employed to establish validity. The conclusion is that if Shabda is not recognized to be a pramana in the empirical sphere of on the ground of its proneness to doubt or incoherence, then it will be equally applied to the inference of the speaker's intentions too. If secular statements are not pramanas, then inference of concealed intentions with the leap of faith rather than leap of reason too cannot be so. In conclusion, I state that we agree that we cannot reject testimonial knowledge in all respect, and it would leave human being epistemically improvised. As most of our knowledge, be it science, history, or everyday social norms, comes from others' report. Rather than accepting testimony as an independent pramana, we should accept it only when it is supported by other pramanas that contributes to the reliable and coherent belief system. The epistemic goal in the case of testimony then becomes more a matter of pragmatic reliability, and perhaps more research is needed to be established the epistemic mechanism underlying its validity. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I have to cut it short because I've taken enough time on this. Thank you. Before I
Thanks for inviting
read
me,
out,
and thank you, Professor Pandya, for that very interesting paper. Um, when I was reading the paper, I was learning a lot about Indian epistemology, and I couldn't help but compare it to non-Indian approaches to testimonial knowledge or epistemology that I am somewhat more familiar with. So I'm going to structure my commentary using this diagram before us. I'm going to take a look at what Indian problematizations of testimonial knowledge have in common with non-Indian approaches. By non-Indian approaches, I mean Western or Filipino approaches. And then I'm going to take a look at what we can learn from each tradition and how they might be able to interact. So I'm going to start with what I found to be common between the paper and other approaches to testimonial knowledge. So, 2 points. First, I think a very central theme in the paper was the reductionism versus credulism debate, which turns on the question of when exactly is testimonial belief justified, or whether we should reduce testimonial belief to non-testimonial grounds, or rather, what should our default attitude be towards testimony? Roughly speaking, this debate is divided into two camps. On one hand, you have reductionists who claim that testimonial belief is justified only when it rests on non-testimonial evidence, like perception or memory. For reductionists, we should doubt testimony by default. On the other hand, you have credulists who claim that we do not always need non-testimonial evidence to justify testimonial belief, and that we can trust testimony by default. Now, an interesting addition I inferred from the paper was that Indian epistemology includes non-testimonial evidence that is not commonly found in non-Indian approaches. For example, on page 5 of Professor Pandya's paper, he also mentions religion, gentlemanly culture, or a communitarian pursuit of seeking truth as among the epistemic resources that could be used to possibly reduce testimony. So my first impression was Indian epistemology seems to avail of more epistemic resources, and I think that's a very interesting point. The second common theme that I found in the paper concerned the nature of justification itself. What exactly is it, or what does it mean to justify testimonial belief? Professor Pandya named two kinds of regress problems in his paper. First, he talked about circularity. He says to know that the speaker is trustworthy or expert or apta, one must already know that the truth of what they say. One must already know the truth of what they say, in which case testimony is redundant. That is a very interesting circular problem found in Cody and Wright. And the second regress problem has to deal with the problem of infinite regress. We can justify testimonial belief based on another testimony, which is justified by another testimony, and so on and so on. Now, obviously, this results in an infinite regress, something which Audie races, he calls it indefinitely long chains of testimony. Um, but I do think that Indian epistemology, or at least the Indian approaches that were presented in the paper, have a potential solution that may not be available to non-Indian approaches, which I think could serve as a possible termination point to this sort of regress. And that additional solution involves faith in the divine or the supernatural. Which leads me to the second part of the presentation. I think that Indian approaches to epistemology have some very interesting nuances that are not commonly found in other literatures. So the first point is that Indian epistemology, as I mentioned, problematizes even religious or spiritual testimony along non-religious or non-spiritual testimony. The paper cites the Vedas or other sacred texts as forms of testimony. Uh, the paper says, given that critical rationality is the epistemic goal, spiritual testimony must be evaluated by the same criteria applied to other pramanas or sources of knowledge: coherence, experience, and practical success. Now, I found this very interesting because in other non-Indian philosophies, normally this sort of problem is relegated to philosophy of religion. For example, in Western epistemology, whether we can trust religious testimony is relegated to philosophy of religion. You know the work of Alvin Plantinga about reformed epistemology. And when we're considering religious or spiritual epistemology, they normally seem to have different justification conditions because a human testifier seems to have different criteria for credibility than a divine or supernatural testifier might have. Now, I had a very interesting reflection while I was reading this part of the paper. Um, Treating religious testimony uh, along the same lines or with the same criteria as other forms of testimony, like human testimony, can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, I think religious testimony does not seem to need justification like other forms of testimony because it is already grounded in divine sources. We normally have to establish the credibility of human testifiers, but we normally do not feel it is necessary to justify sacred sources, which we consider to be absolute or basically truthful. On the other hand, the problem of justification no longer becomes a matter of credibility of the speaker, but it seems to become a problem of establishing the authority of those divine sources as authoritative, which will lead to a further problem, which I will discuss later. Another interesting aspect that I found related to this point was that Mimamsa ties testimonial knowledge to Dharma. I found this portion of the paper very interesting because in my interpretation or in my understanding, testimony doesn't just have an epistemological dimension in Indian philosophy, but it also has an ethical dimension. How does testimonial knowledge lead to practical guidance in achieving a ritual life or achieving a peaceful or practically guided life? The second point, which I found exclusive to Indian approaches, has to deal with their stronger emphasis on pragmatic criteria of justification, especially in conversational contexts. So, for example, in non-Indian epistemology, focuses on how to establish the trustworthiness of testifiers. See the paper of Cody in 1973. In the Philippines, epistemologists seem to probe into other aspects like the testifier's loob, their goodwill, their conscientiousness, if you may. But I thought that it was interesting that Indian epistemology problematizes specifically linguistic competencies of testifiers. And I must admit, I have not encountered this sort of argument before, and I do think it's very promising. For example, the paper names criteria for speakers like syntactic expectancy or akanksha, semantic fitness or yogyata, and proximity or samnidhana. Apart from criteria of speakers, which is normally the party that we have to assess for credibility, there are also justificatory concerns for audiences. For example, we must determine whether audiences are competent language users, whether they can or whether they have the ability to recognize syntactic and semantic structures, whether they are able to move from individual words to the meaning of sentences. So there is an element of compositionality there. And I was thinking maybe non-Indian epistemologies, like Western epistemologies, can incorporate the works of H.P. Grice, who does deal with pragmatic criteria or conversational contexts. My own question for this point was normally the burden falls on audiences to determine the trustworthiness of testifiers. Indian epistemology flips this around. Not only do audiences have a burden to assess the speaker, but even the speaker or some other party who might be listening to a testimony has the burden of establishing the credibility of audiences as well. Now, that for me was a very interesting 180-degree turn that, speaks to the dynamic intersocial character of testimony. Which leads me to the final point of my commentary. What can non-Indian approaches add? Now, a frequent problem raised in the paper was that India contains many conflicting traditions. The paper asks, how can testimony-based belief in any one tradition count as rationally justified? And I suspect this has to do with the central importance of community life and diversity within India. I think non-Indian epistemology promises some interesting solutions. For example, there are pluralist or standpoint epistemologies which show that diversity can actually improve knowledge within communities rather than narrow them. Local epistemologies like the feminist epistemology of Longino can show how objectivity can actually be increased amidst diversity. Or in Filipino philosophy, testimony has an ethical dimension, such as what we owe to our loob or our kapya. Alternatively, I think new social problems can be raised by social epistemology. For example, do conflicting epistemic traditions within India cause epistemic injustices? For my last point, right? Another problem the paper raises involves a problem for Buddhist epistemologists. The paper cites the epistemic burden of inferring the credibility and intentions of the speaker's statement. Now, I think that non-Indian approaches tend to have a bit of a broader approach in this respect by looking at non-linguistic factors as well to assess the credibility or intentions of speakers. These include non-verbal cues, non-linguistic material, or social status, or the social status of a speaker. Or in the Philippine context, it might include Filipino virtues underlying testimony, such as utang na loob or interpersonal justice. So, essentially, right, I found the paper as a whole very interesting because it is so consistent with Western or Filipino problems in epistemology, but at the same time, it adds so many interesting nuances that I think non-Indian epistemologies can reflect on and learn from as well. So thank you for that interesting paper and thank you for your time.